Hey, it's Jordan. I am delighted to be joined by Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone, and finally some good news. For those that don't know, the frivolous charges you were dealing with from, I mean, I guess D.C., but really the U.S. government was behind those charges were dropped. So before we get to kind of what the charges were and all that, can you kind of give us an idea? This came months later after your reporting at the Venezuelan embassy. And kind of for those that don't know, what happened on the morning you were arrested.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on, and thanks to everyone who's been so supportive of me through this ordeal. And everybody who has been calling for me to be imprisoned for a false charge. I'm in the middle of a long Twitter thread, uh, just exposing everyone who cheered on my arrest. And there are some major pundits in there. But basically, on May 8th in the early morning, there were a number of activists and journalists, including two close colleagues of mine, close friends, Alex Rubinstein and Anya Parampil, inside the Venezuelan embassy. All of these people were there defending international law against a Trump administration coup attempt in Venezuela. They were there with the permission of the UN recognized Venezuelan government, and they were surrounded by a mob of violent right wing Venezuelan diaspora hooligans who were connected to Juan Guaido's operation in DC, which was basically, funded and supported by the US government. And it was pretty clear that this element was working hand in glove with the Secret Service special police who were operating under the auspices of the State Department. And their goal was to starve out the activists and prevent them from receiving sanitary supplies, medicine. They ultimately got the city to cut off electricity and water. And my goal and the goal of those of us on the outside was to get them food in a completely legal and nonviolent fashion. The Secret Service had told us you're allowed to deliver food. And it looked like they were just using these hooligans who were camping out around the embassy as a proxy force to do what they couldn't do because they couldn't legally obstruct food. So we brought food on the morning of May 8th and basically just walked to the embassy and dropped food off to the activists inside, to the chagrin of the opposition activists. And we caught them by surprise, and it wasn't the only food delivery. Everything was done completely legally and nonviolently. I didn't touch anybody. I don't even think anybody touched me. But I was identified on camera on one of the cell phone cameras, and they said, "Oh shit, this is Max Blumenthal. He's one of our top journalistic critics." That's what I think happened. His site, the Gray Zone, has been going after us and actually doing structural damage to our coup. We've ultimately, we've done enormous damage to them journalistically with facts. And so I think I was targeted. 5 months later, police showed up at my door. By the way, I was documenting everything that was happening behind the scenes, wondering if one day it could come out as part of a documentary or something. So I was also conducting journalism at the time. But yeah, I'm an editor, and I'm trying to get food to the journalists inside who are embedded, and I'm also an activist. I wanted to keep the operation going, to defend international law, to obstruct this insane, violent, illegal coup. So anyway, 5 months later, DC police show up in the morning, drag me out of my house. They threatened to break down my door if I didn't let them in. It was a team of cops. I learned later that I'd been listed as armed and dangerous, which is a designation that it appears on 3% of arrest warrants. Almost always for people who have a previous record of homicide or who are on the run for a violent crime. I don't have any of that. And I spent 2 days in jail. Being in jail and like central booking and then going through all of the different processes where U.S. Marshals anally search you and everything. then being shackled in a cold box while you wait for a judge to call on you. It's pretty excruciating, and it's what, my mostly poor and working class black neighbors often go through. So I'm not like alone in that regard, but you don't get a call to a lawyer. You don't get a call to anyone. If no one had witnessed my arrest, no one would have known I was in there. So the whole process was agonizing, and I got out, was released on my own recognizance. And last week on Thursday,
Just to back up, you weren't allowed
yeah,
a phone call either.
I was not allowed a phone call. No. Luckily, Bill Moran, who served as my valiant counsel, he heard that I'd been arrested because people were there to witness the arrest. And so he showed up. But that's the only way that, basically, if you get locked up in DC, it's very difficult to make a phone call. They don't expect you to really assert your rights, even though everybody does and people know their rights. And then they eventually put you in this box the following day where you're on the other side of bulletproof glass, and public defenders sort of show up for a few people. Otherwise, I mean, just to give you a few details of what it's like in there. I mean, you're either in a cell with one cellmate that's a 5x7 cell with a toilet and a barely functional water fountain and a bologna sandwich for like 14 hours. And then you're thrown in various boxes with like 50 to 80 guys. And people who are mentally ill and unable to function are thrown in that box with you because they're just picked up on the street for being homeless or missing bail or whatever. And those people are they just basically wait around, and then they just get shackled, and a U.S. Marshal physically drags them in front of a magistrate judge, and there's just a public defender who shows up for them. And the public defenders, it's like a factory line where they just have one person after another, one poor person or a mentally ill person that they have to defend. So it's really shocking to witness that. But what I was jailed for was a false charge concocted by a Venezuelan opposition activist. The Venezuelan opposition obviously thought about how they wanted to go about this, and so they found who they thought would be the most sympathetic person, who was a 59 or 58-year-old woman. And so they wanted to say, I attacked a woman along with Benjamin Rubenstein, who was with me at the time. And so we were just identified, but there were like 20 people involved in delivering food. Nobody on our side attacked anybody, as far as I know. It was completely nonviolent, but we were ID'd. I'm like the high-profile guy they wanted to go after. Ben is the brother of Alex Rubenstein, a frequent contributor to the Gray Zone. And so, yeah, they went after us because of who we were. We were politically persecuted. 5 months after this happened, though, they showed up at my door. And I don't know how the warrant just sat around for all that time. I was told that a judge actually rejected the warrant. I don't know why it was executed, but the prosecutor threw out the case after it became clear, first, that the Secret Service call logs of that night, May 8th, at like around 3 a.m., had mysteriously disappeared. I don't know why they disappeared, but you could maybe theorize that they didn't want certain records to come out proving their collusion with this right-wing mob of violent hooligans. The other, I mean, I don't know why else they would have destroyed evidence like that. And then there was the fact that there was no evidence against me because I'm completely innocent. I didn't kick any 58-year-old woman. And if anything, the people on our side were consistently being assaulted. I mean, if you were at the embassy, you were going to be assaulted by these fanatics, either verbally or physically. If you were a person of color, if you were, trans or queer or whatever, if you were a woman, they were going to say something homophobic, racist, or sexist to you, and you were likely to get assaulted if you tried to do anything like get food inside. So in any case, I'm completely cleared, and I think we need to look at securing justice so this doesn't happen again, because it's really disturbing that somebody can just accuse you of something you didn't do for political reasons, and then a team of police shows up at your door assuming you're armed and dangerous, and anything can happen there. And then you have to spend 2 days in this really agonizing, going through this really agonizing experience of prison. And then, if I had had to go through all of this, if the charges hadn't been dropped, I would have had to throw down like $10,000 on lawyers. So that could happen to anyone involved in activism or journalism, unless we take some form of recourse here. So I'm exploring my options.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people will look at this and think this is something that just began because Trump is president, and we have right-wing fascists in the government. But if you look back to Standing Rock and even before that, there's been kind of extrajudicial activities like this happening in America for a long time. And in the case of the Venezuelan embassy collective, international law was violated throughout because the activists and journalists had permission by Venezuelan leaders to be there, as did journalists that were covering it. So it seems that it's kind of this up is down, house of mirrors type of thing, that the people supposed to be enforcing the law are allowing right-wing fanatics to break the law.
We documented it, and Alex Rubinstein documented it very well at Mint Press. The racism and the fanaticism and the violence of that opposition mob was on full display in the middle of a neighborhood in Washington, D.C., this multicultural city. If you can imagine, and this was a pro-Trump right-wing mob, you can imagine if they were white nationalists who displayed a lot of the same behaviors, there wouldn't have been the Washington Post coming down there and writing these obvious hit jobs on the peace activists that completely presented the whole spectacle from a pro-opposition, pro-Guaido frame. And the Washington Post even reported the false allegations against me and Ben Rubenstein without naming us, because these opposition fanatics had a press conference where they accused us of violence. But there was no follow-up. The Washington Post didn't show up when I was arrested. This is a really high-profile incident. You knew about it from the beginning because everyone on Twitter was talking about it, and alternative media was writing about it. And these, regime change blue check marks were celebrating my arrest, but the Washington Post didn't touch it. There was no follow-up at all because it would have shown the Venezuelan opposition in a very bad light, along with the DC police, who made no effort to investigate this, and the Secret Service, who were colluding with the right-wing opposition, who were like sort of the Venezuelan analog of the Charlottesville neo-Nazis. I mean, this was a fascistic mob that was violent and racist and sexist and was basically holding an occupation around an embassy that they wanted to take over in violation of international law. And so right now, we're 6 months on from that incident, and we can put it in an international framework and look at it in a broader way. Who is the Trump administration actually dealing with right now in Venezuela? They're dealing with the Maduro administration, which was elected and is recognized by the UN, which controls all institutions of the state, but there's no embassy here. Juan Guaido's operation is run by this former ExxonMobil tax lawyer named Carlos Vecchio, who's set up this caucus with Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Mario Diaz-Balart in Congress to push regime change, but he controls nothing in Washington. It's so obvious that the Trump administration is dealing with the Venezuelan government. They're doing all of these kind of sanctions waivers for Chevron, and to do that, they have to deal with the Maduro administration. So they've implicitly recognized the Maduro administration. Juan Guaido is in trouble for all of these corruption allegations. He's losing public support. Only 10% of the Venezuelan public trusts him, according to the most recent poll. He's done. The coup is over. And so we have 4 more people on trial facing a year in prison and $100,000 fines. Adrian Pine, David Paul, Kevin Zeese, and Margaret Flowers. The last two actually were involved in starting Occupy DC. These are some of the best progressive anti-war activists this country has to offer, and they're on trial for a year for being illegally in the embassy. And that prosecution is predicated on the notion that Carlos Vecchio is actually the legitimate ambassador and Juan Guaido is actually the president of Venezuela. So it's predicated on a hallucination. It's predicated on Elliot Abrams' fever dreams and not on reality. And so that's shocking too. We need to consider that too. So I hope, we don't just look at this in terms of a journalist being persecuted by an element that's actually backed by the US government, but that activists in general are being put on trial for a complete lie when they had every right to be in that embassy, just as the legitimate Venezuelan government does.
And let me ask you, because I've kind of experienced some dicey situations as a journalist. There's very few actually like in the field, independent journalists. Of course, there's
it's hard to do.
Yeah, there's documentary filmmakers, and there's obviously aspiring people that we might not know of yet. But in terms of alternative, progressive field journalists, there's very few. So it seems like you said, this is an effort, whether it's a foreign government or coordinating with domestic law enforcement, to try and kind of eliminate those journalists. How can we protect ourselves, not just journalists, but activists that do forms of journalism going forward? Because, it's not like incidents like this aren't going to pop up again. It's not like there's not going to be more protests where you have anti-war people up against these right-wing groups.
As far as, us protecting ourselves, one thing that this incident showed is that the sort of press freedom organizations are not going to protect us, and that they don't actually exist to defend press freedom. They exist to defend U.S. empire, particularly the Committee to Protect Journalists. It's just obvious and actually they just had their award ceremony in Washington and brought a bunch of regime change activists who are not even known as journalists in their own country, like 100% Noticias from Nicaragua, up to meet with Mike Pence. The Committee to Protect Journalists brought them to a meeting with Mike Pence, and then they honored them on stage. But, obviously they said nothing about me. They've been very muted on Julian Assange, who is facing, I think, 150 years in prison and, could be extradited to the U.S., a country he's not a citizen of, and tortured and interrogated and possibly tortured. As Chelsea Manning, I think, has experienced torture. So, and what would Julian Assange be hauled over here for? Journalism, publishing, just embarrassing the empire. What is the protection for Julian Assange? We don't really have any protection. So I was lucky enough to have Bill Moran step up for me actually a few years ago when I started falling under an obviously coordinated attack machine aiming to paint me and the Gray Zone as this kind of Russian-controlled secret fascist operation. And, I know Bill as well. He's been a real ally. He's never asked for anything from me. He's just a courageous person who's like an angel. But we really need lawyers to step up. If you're a lawyer, if you're legally trained, and you care about the work we're doing, we need people to step up. And we can set up kind of do fundraisers for them, but there has to be some kind of network of lawyers to defend independent journalists who are doing the kind of work we're doing. And obviously, if you're watching this, support Status Coup and support the work I'm doing, because we don't have like global billionaires, paying our bills, and we're not state funded either. So it's a tough position to be in. It's why media is shrinking, the media is collapsing. It's why there are so few independent journalists who are able to go out in the field. And then there's now a obvious crackdown on the work we're doing. And I should mention that me being arrested and this false allegation is not the only attack we're facing exploiting the legal system to shut us down. And I'll be saying more about that in the coming days, but that's really all I can say for now. But there is a clear operation involving powerful elements to shut us down, to silence us.